So let's think about different combinations of stimuli and whether a stimuli is deemed as desirable or not desirable by the learner. So think of this 2 by 2 matrix. On one hand, we have the idea of whether or not the environmental stimuli is satisfying or not. So think of the two columns of this matrix. So the first column is if what the environment presents you is something you want, such as in the case of the pigeon, food. However, it's also possible for the environment to present something that you don't want. Say, with Albert, this loud sound that it found unpleasant. So you have to first of all think about when the environment presents a stimulus, is that stimulus satisfying? Again, like a pigeon getting fed, or is it not satisfying? Is it aversive, like Albert not liking that loud sound? So you have satisfying in the first column, you have not satisfying in the second column. Now, as far as the rows, you have the idea of whether or not an environmental stimulus is presented to you, or if that stimulus is taken away, right? So you can probably imagine like studies where you have, say, pigeons getting fed if they do things that the researcher wants them to do. So that would be presenting them. But you could also imagine the food being taken away if the pigeons were doing things that the researchers didn't want them to do. So think of the two rows here as giveth or taketh away. So again, we have a 2 by 2 matrix. We have two different dimensions. We have whether or not a stimulus is presented or not, and we have whether or not that stimulus is satisfying. And so there's 4 possibilities. And so I'm going to walk you through all 4 of these. The first, and we saw this with the pigeon and Skinner's experiments, you have positive reinforcement. And so positive reinforcement is when there's a particular behavioral response, that's the R in SRS, that is desirable. And to reinforce that desirable behavior, you present something that the learner wants, like food. So positive reinforcement, classic example of this is like if you have a pet and your pet does something that you want to encourage, you want the pet to do more of it, you give it a treat. That would be a classic example of positive reinforcement. You're presenting something that your pet wants. Okay, now in contrast, let's move over to this cell. This is also presenting something, but now it's presenting something that the learner does not want. So let's say you have a pet and the pet does something you don't want the pet to do. If you were to present something to the pet that the pet did not like, that would be an example of punishment. The idea would be that the dog would associate doing certain things as resulting in the presentation of things the dog does not want. Okay. And so again, just in this first row, this is when you have a stimulus presented and it becomes an issue of, is the stimulus something that the learner wants? That would be positive reinforcement, or something that the learner does not want. That would be an example of punishment. Let's move to the next row now. So the next row is taketh away. So this is when an environmental stimuli is taken away after some behavior. So let's say that there's this behavior and you have a learner liking something, right? So this is a satisfying stimulus. And if they do something that you don't want them to do, you take away the thing that they liked. Okay, so by taking away something that they liked, that's not desirable for them. So they begin to associate, okay, well, if I do a certain behavior, this thing that I like is going to be taken away from me. Okay, and so an example of that might be if you have a child and they are misbehaving, having them take time out. So in a way, what you're doing is you're taking away their freedom. And that might not be desirable to them, and they might begin to associate certain behaviors with having their freedom taken away. The final cell, this is also in the taketh away category, but now you're taking away something that is bad. Okay, this is actually when you're taking away something that's bad, you're actually trying to encourage more of the behavior. And the reason being is that if it's bad and you take it away, well, that's good because you don't want stuff that's bad. So this is negative reinforcement. And so an example of negative reinforcement might be, some of you might have like a sound that plays in your car before you buckle your seatbelt. And often that sound is designed to not be pleasant, and that sound does not go off until you buckle your seatbelt. So what's happening is that you're being presented with a stimulus that's aversive. You don't like it. And it's not taken away until you do a behavior that is trying to be reinforced. And that behavior is buckling your seatbelt. So that would be an example of negative reinforcement. And so I think that it's important here to note that negative reinforcement is not necessarily a bad thing. The negative in negative reinforcement comes from the fact that something's being taken away, but what's being taken away is something that you don't like. So that's actually good. And what happens when you have that negative and negative reinforcement, people sometimes conflate negative reinforcement with punishment, but they're not the same thing. Punishment is it's introducing something that the learner does not like to try to stop a behavior. Negative reinforcement is taking away something that is bad to actually reinforce the behavior. You're actually trying to get them to do more of it. Negative reinforcement and punishment are not the same thing.